That always being gone. That changed what you call. Always managed.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, commissioners and participants. I'm now turning on the ability for you to start your video and audio.
All right, are we ready to get started?
I believe so, Mr. Vice Chair.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Varner, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Little Hoover Commission. I am standing in place of the famous Pedro Nava today, so bear with me. We obviously thank you all for joining today on this important topic. I'd like to introduce the other commissioners who are here with us on Zoom. Joining us today are I didn't see her on, but I think she'll be joining us. Commissioner Erner, Commissioner David Beyer, Commissioner Cynthia Buiza, Commissioner Anthony Cannella, Commissioner Bill Emerson, Commissioner Gil Garcetti, and Commissioner Janice Sidley. We have four members of our legislative members of our commission. That's Assembly Member Tasha Borner Horvath, Assembly Member Philip Chen, Senator David Min, Senator Jim Nielsen, and obviously Commissioner Chairman Nava. He may be attending, but we're not sure.
He is not able to attend this session, unfortunately, Mr. Vice Chair.
Okay. Also with us today is our commission staff, the Executive Director Ethan Rarick, Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster, Project Managers Crystal Beckham and Tristan Stein, and analysts Sherry McAllister and Ashley Hurley. They do great work. Let me do some housekeeping before we turn on the subject at hand, just some Zoom protocols for everybody. For advisory committee participants and commissioners, your audio and video will be turned on throughout the roundtable. However, we ask that you mute yourself when you're not speaking to avoid background noise and such. Use the raise hand feature in Zoom to indicate that you'd like to make a comment or address something another participant said, or if you have questions or comments with some of the topics that we're discussing. And you'll be added to what is a virtual queue. We will attempt to take you in order as the hands come up. We've also opened up the chat feature, so as I see people are doing already, you can share resources throughout the discussion for future use, such as links to useful websites or documents, and even just your information, your contact information. The chat will be visible to members of the public, though they will not be able to contribute. In the chat, we've also included links to today's agenda and short bios of the advisory committee participants. These can also be found on the commission's website. Members of the public will be muted during the roundtable, and we will have a public comment session at the end of the roundtable. So those who wish to make a comment will be unmuted during public comment session. If you'd like to make a public comment, use the raise hand feature again by clicking on the hand icon to join our public comment queue. Those who have joined us by phone may either dial *9 to raise their hand on Zoom, or you can send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov indicating you'd like to address the commission. You must provide the phone number from which you've joined the meeting so our staff knows who to unmute. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails requests throughout our hearing. As is usual at commission hearings, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker for a total of 30 minutes today. There will be additional opportunities to provide public comment at the commission's second hearing on the topic. Please be advised that we are recording today's roundtable, and after the roundtable, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to our YouTube and Facebook page, so you'll all be social media famous. And now to the substance of today's roundtable. Today's advisory committee roundtable is the second in a series of the commission events on California's Developmental Disabilities system. At our first hearing, we did discuss what it's like for individuals and the problems that they're having with intellectual and development disabilities and their families to access the services for service providers to participate in the system. In 2 weeks, we will hold a second hearing to explore how the system identifies, tracks, and responds to disparities within the system and learn about the work underway to understand the root causes for these disparities. Today, we will explore creative solutions to reduce disparities and increase access to services. We are joined by individuals and family members of those with disabilities, health policy advocates, researchers, service providers, and individuals from the Department of Development Services and Regional Center Association. I'd like to thank all of you for taking your valuable time to participate in this roundtable and for sharing your time and expertise with us. Before we begin our roundtable discussion, I would like to ask Commissioners Emerson and Erner, who serve on the Commission subcommittee and on this state's development disability system, if they'd like to make any comments.
Thank you, Vice Chair. My name is Bill Emerson, and I just want to thank the advisory committee participants today to provide excellent discussion for us about the issues and challenges that face providers and consumers of California's developmental disability system. And I look forward to an informative and thoughtful conversation. Thank you.
And Mr. Vice Chair, I can tell you that Commissioner Erner texted me very late last night to say that she had had an emergency situation come up and she could not attend today. She was very, very regretful of that, but she will be watching the recording and taking into account what is said here today. So she apologizes for missing today's session.
Okay, well, I would like just to make a quick comment and thank Commissioner Emerson and Commissioner Erner on their leadership on this topic, both on this commission and previously in the legislature. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster, who organized this roundtable, and thank you for all your efforts in putting this together. It looks like we have an impressive panel for the roundtable. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you again to all of the participants who have joined us today and those who are also watching. Just a quick reminder that today's conversation is meant really to be a true discussion among all of the participants here about possible solutions to address inequities and improve access in this system. We really hope to encourage a frank exchange of ideas, but we're not here to try and reach consensus on any one point. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Let's begin by talking about oversight of the system and whether there needs to be more done to address the various disparities and experiences. We heard at our previous meeting about various disparities and experiences, such as the way individuals access the system and the types of services that are available to them, to variations in the ways policies and regulations are interpreted across the system. We also heard about variations in processes, like those to onboard new consumers or to certify service providers as vendors. So the first question for the group is there appropriate oversight today to respond to these various types of inconsistencies? And what more is needed to direct system-wide change? And so if anybody, we've got Ms. Martin.
Hi, thank you so much. Honor and privilege to be here on behalf of Special Needs Network. I'm the president and founder. And I represent hundreds of thousands of children and their families that live in underserved and under-resourced communities throughout California. A lot of our work is in Los Angeles County, particularly in SPA 6 or what's considered South LA. One of the questions I have is, the way the regional center system is set up under the Lanterman Act is you have these 21 distinct centers that are governed by their own independent board of directors, yet they receive these huge sums of state dollars to manage and then to disperse. And the oversight is very difficult, even for someone like myself. I'm a very experienced civil rights lawyer, very experienced advocate, and even advocating on behalf of my organization and families, it can be very challenging. So when families face difficulties at their local regional centers, trying to elevate that to Department of Developmental Services is very challenging. So I guess my question is, should we be rethinking this whole concept of how regional centers are set up to have these independent agencies that literally, some of them get $300 million from the state, and although there is some oversight, I'm just wondering, in our system of government, are there other systems that mirror this, where independent agencies can develop their own board of directors and receive that kind of funding from the state in the way that regional centers do? I think it makes oversight incredibly difficult, if not impossible. DDS does have some, I guess, authority to take action, but literally because these agencies are set up as independent agencies with their own boards of directors, it becomes very difficult for DDS to take the kinds of action that would otherwise be taken if they were more closely aligned, or if they were somehow under the auspices of the state. Like if there's a state agency and there's a problem, I know where to go, and there's accountability. But I just wonder if we should be thinking in this moment about whether the structure is currently situated or has been historically situated, that if it continues to be the best way to serve families, particularly as we get more minority families, more low income, more low resource families that just don't have the funds to hire high priced lawyers and advocates to advocate on their behalf.
Mr. Netman?
Thank you. So I think the question raised by the previous speaker is a very important one. And if I may, I'd like to, as a non-Californian, offer something of a national perspective, because California's regional center system is unusual. While there are some exceptions, Ohio, for example, maintains a largely county-based DD service system. There are a few other states that do have some significant sub-state entity with some degree of independence in order to manage developmental disability services. The majority of states do have a unitary developmental disability service agency that maintains a much more direct relationship with provider networks, consumers, and other stakeholders within the developmental disability service system. Now, having said that, the majority of states are not the size of California. And I think one of the trade-offs that comes up here is there are some significant advantages to a local approach to developmental disability services, in particular with respect to the placement of case managers, with respect to the opportunity to have significant administrative attention focused on highly complex individuals and supporting their needs, in particular when attempting to transition people from more to less restrictive service settings. A lot of the states, that I believe, and that many of the national quality monitoring projects believe have some of the best outcomes in developmental disability services, like Vermont, Oregon, a number of others, have relatively small populations that they're serving. So I think part of the challenge we're dealing with here is the regional center system does create some significant inequities, right? It does not make sense that if you're on one side of a dividing line in a regional center, you get access to one set of things, and if you're on the other side of a dividing line, you get access to another set of things. And that, I think, becomes especially concerning when we talk about some of the systems change priorities that are particularly important and are on the cutting edge of developmental disability services. The shift away from sheltered workshops towards supported employment, the shift away from not just developmental centers, but frankly, over the long term, away from large group homes towards supported community living. There's huge disparities between regional centers, as well as within regional centers, that really call out for more oversight. At the same time, we deal with this, I think, quite significant challenge that we probably would not want to see a case management system or a provider efforts to manage provider networks that were not sufficiently attentive to the local context. I think, in particular with respect to a state as large as California, a challenge that I feel exists is the absence of adequate independent infrastructure for supporting people with disabilities and families to understand how to get what they need from the regional center service system. You do have entities like the Protection and Advocacy Agency, Disability Rights California, the various federally funded parent training information centers and others that can provide this information, but they are underfunded and they are not reaching the entirety of self-advocates and families. So I would argue that one way that we may want to think about as we try and balance these competing needs for greater accountability and uniformity with the admitted advantages of some degree of local case management and provider network management, additional resources for those types of entities that are independent of both the state and the regional center, and serve as a check and help organize self-advocates and families to address some of these disparities in the service system.
Thank you for that. Ms. Mark?
Thank you. Thank you so much to the Little Hoover Commission for having these sets of hearings and discussions. They're so important. And I wanted to piggyback on what both Areva and Ari have talked about. And I do think that these sets of hearings give us a great opportunity to think afresh, to think anew about the regional center system and the developmental disability system and whether it's working or not. At the hearing on October 13th, we heard speaker after speaker talk about a broken system, a system that wasn't working for them, for their families. And we hear that at Disability Voices United all the time. We issued a report yesterday that looked at adults and the intense and intractable disparities that exist both within regional centers by race and ethnicity, and both between regional centers across the state. And we have a set of recommendations that are actually more modest than what I believe we should be doing, because I believe we should be thinking big, because we can in this kind of environment of a Little Hoover Commission. But the system is over 50 years old. There are clearly structural problems with the system that make it problematic to even implement really good ideas, such as the self-determination program that Senator Emerson authored. And, I believe that in many cases, the structural problems are not intentional, but that they are there are implicit biases, but also the bureaucracy just feeds on itself and doesn't get out of its own way to allow for innovation and other kinds of things that you need to have to improve people's outcomes. We talk a lot about person-centeredness and an outcome-based system and a system that is equitable, but there's lots of great ideas out there, but we're just not seeing improvements. And part of that, I think, is the desperate need for DDS to provide more extensive oversight and accountability of regional centers. And I think that they have the power to do that. They have contracts with 21 regional centers, and they can demand more from regional centers. So I don't want to minimize that. That is critically important that DDS do a better job. But at the same time, maybe we need to step back and say, is this more than 50-year-old system working? And what I would argue is that it's not. And that one of the inherent problems that exists is that there is a conflict of interest in providing case management and advocacy for people with disabilities within a regional center, as well as being a gatekeeper to services. And in many other states, and Ari is much more of an expert on this than I am, but in many states, they have separate case managers from the actual deciders of how much services you get and what services you get. And I think that for service coordinators at regional centers, it puts them in a very difficult situation because they're there to try to help people, but at the same time, they're often put in the situation to say no. We actually call it a culture of no at regional centers because people come in and say, and they, you know, families get no all the time. That culture of no exists regardless of race and ethnicity. The difference is that people of color who lack resources are not able to overcome those no's and get the regional centers to yes. And so, you know, there have to be better ways that we can do this. And one of the ways, and we can talk about this more later, I believe, is the self-determination program. It takes away the control from institutions like regional centers and the government and gives that control back to the person with the disability to be able to have a life of their choosing, to choose the people they want to support them and to choose those services that will actually provide them with the best outcomes. And I think that the self-determination program is facing tremendous barriers from the bureaucracy that exists in the traditional system, and that the bureaucracy can't get out of its own way to make it succeed. And so, you know, I have some ideas of how we can move forward, but that's kind of the sort of the opening of what I wanted to say.
Thank you again for that. Ms. Westling?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Amy Westling. I'm the director of the Association of Regional Center Agencies. We work with all 21 of the state's regional centers. And so in response to the question about is there adequate oversight, and again, the concern that was raised about some differences between regional centers, I want to reflect back on the creation of this system was done with a great deal of intentionality. And the idea was that rather than having a uniform state system to address our very diverse state, and diverse meaning, you know, race and ethnicity, but also just the vast differences in geography within the state of California, the idea was that regional centers would be responsive both to the state through their contracts. As Ms. Mark noted, regional centers receive their funds through contracts with the Department of Developmental Services. There is a lot of oversight and monitoring already related to our regional centers fulfilling the terms of those contracts. Is there room for additional oversight? I think that's certainly a conversation that can be had, and that there is room for that conversation. But we also need to think back to the reason that regional centers were created to be independent entities was so that they would each have a local board of directors, and that board of directors is their connection to their community, because it's a lot easier to interface with a local board of directors than it is to direct everyone's attention to Sacramento when things perhaps aren't going well, or when people have ideas for improvement or innovative ideas. So when the system works really well, what we see is that there are pockets of innovation within regional centers that then those ideas, what's working, then spreads. So for instance, at Eastern Los Angeles Regional Center, they started the Enhanced Service Coordination Project, which really took a look at how do we better support people who aren't accessing paid supports through regional centers, particularly those who are from non-white or non-English speaking populations. That was an initiative that did really well, and the state was able to see it did well through data. And then other regional centers now have the funds to replicate that program. That's what it looks like when this service system works well. There are 21 pockets of innovation, and we can all learn from one another about what works while maintaining the local flair in terms of what's going to be most responsive to the needs in any one community. I worked for a couple of regional centers, and I can tell you that service delivery was different between them, not because we weren't meeting our community's needs, but because we were. So the needs in the Central Valley and the needs in the greater Sacramento area looked different for some of the families that we served. We had to devote more attention and more energy to transportation, for example, in the Central Valley. We had to think more about migrant populations. And so that's the beauty of this system. And I would just encourage us to focus on how can we build upon its strengths. Thank you.
Commissioner Emerson, I see you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question of Ms. Westlake. Is the oversight process standardized in each of the 21 regional centers? And then I have a second part after I hear that answer.
The oversight on the part of the state, is that the question?
Yes, or program oversight.
So the state audits regional centers and provides a lot of oversight, and that oversight is consistent from the state to each regional center. So there are regularly scheduled audits related to how funds are spent. There are regularly scheduled audits related to compliance with federal expectations, both in our Lanterman program as well as in our Early Start program. So the state provides the same type and degree of oversight to regional centers on a regularly scheduled basis that's outlined in both regional center contract as well as statute.
And secondly, I'm under the impression that consumers make up the board and that are also part of the oversight process.
Yes, so the requirements for regional center board composition are outlined in statute, and our requirements include that at least 25% of the individuals on each regional center's board of directors must be individuals supported by the board, supported by the regional center, excuse me, and the total of the number of people who are either individuals served or family members must be at least 50% of the regional center's board. There are also requirements related to geographic representation as well as racial and ethnic, as well as professional experience.
So when a conflict arises between the board and the administration of the regional center, are they protected from any retribution by the administration?
So if there's a conflict between individual board members and the executive leadership at the regional center, is that the question?
Yes.
Yes, every regional center has whistleblower protections in place.
Okay. And then my final question with respect to regional centers, can you explain why there's such a large difference between our program discrepancies within the 21 regional centers? And I give you an example of Harbor and West Side. Just across the street, one regional center will have vastly larger services than the other on the other side of the street. Why is that?
So each regional center's services have grown up organically within the regional center. I think it's also important to note that you reference Harbor and West Side, that within the LA County area, it's very common for regional centers to use the vendors of other regional centers, if you will. So if regional centers find that a service that is needed isn't readily available in their catchment area, they can use service providers that are in other areas. And I think one of the things that we've seen additionally is that when we look at kind of the broad swath of services that are provided, different regional center catchment areas also have varying degrees of available community supports. While it's really complicated. I understand that, and certainly I heard Ms. Mark raise the issue of that families feel like regional centers send them to generic agencies first. That's been around since the beginning of the Lanterman Act. It's just that there's a more complex web of available community services now. And so that's part of the challenge, but each regional center area has different community services available. And really the charge of the regional center is to fill in behind those services. So the services that the regional centers provide may vary from one area to another. An additional factor has to do with, in all honesty, how many former developmental center residents live in each catchment area. Those former residents tend to be white, and they tend to have service needs that are very expensive. So the composite of their impact on overall spending can't be overstated.
Okay, thank you. I may have some more questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Sidley, before we get to you, I just wanted to let folks know the lineup since we have a number of raised hands. After your question, we have Ms. Hahn, and then we have Ms. Martin, and then we have Mr. Jardini. And thank you, Amy. Commissioner Sidley.
Yeah, I'll be exceedingly brief. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here today. I am new to this issue, and so I apologize up front that many of my questions are going to sound very pedestrian, but I want to just try to understand a few things. The board of directors that you speak of, Ms. Westling, are they paid? Are those paid positions?
No.
So those people are working as volunteers?
They are volunteer positions.
Okay. And then actually to Ari's point, and I apologize if you actually answered this, but you were speaking of other states, and you did point out the size of California versus other states. At some point through this discussion today, I'd like to understand the size of California's population that we serve, what other states might be close to that, and the size of the budgeting that California spends on these issues versus other states. Generally, my belief is that California has a larger population. Obviously, we're huge and we spend more per capita, but I'd like to, at some point through this discussion, to understand that as well. So that's just the framework, and I appreciate everybody understanding that I am new to this whole topic, but thank you all very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Sidley. Next, we'll have Ms. Hahn, followed by Ms. Martin, and then Mr. Jardini and Mr. Ne'eman.
Thank you so much. And thank you, commissioners, again, for the opportunity to be here today. I wanted to respond to a few of the very good points that some of my colleagues here have been making. First, I wanted to talk about what Ms. Westling was saying in terms of identifying promising practices at different regional centers. And what we're really talking about today is basic civics 101, right? What are the pros and the cons of more centralized government versus more decentralized government? And we know that there are benefits, right? And there can be challenges depending on how things are implemented and how the system is led. So I appreciate the model that Ms. Westling has pointed out, where local governments can be thought of as labs of innovation, right? Small labs of innovation that can trial and test out different things in ways that can be responsive to the local context. I would love personally to see more ability to identify where regional centers are doing things well, and to find ways to scale those. And one thing that I would offer is that I have seen at different regional centers a yearning, at least from some of them, for a stronger hand from DDS in terms of issuing guidance, issuing directives, looking to DDS to say there are there's a lot happening in a very complex landscape, and it would be very helpful to have some clearer direction about where to go. That's one thing. Another thing I think DDS could be helpful in is in prioritizing or better prioritizing, identifying those models of success, lifting them up, and then providing support or incentives for scaling those models that we see work on a local level. Thus far, I have not seen a tremendous emphasis on that from DDS. And so I think that that is something that we might want to look for. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about again was the concept of local control. And as Mr. Naaman was mentioning earlier, I mean, there are many potential benefits to having, and Ms. Westling as well, there are many potential benefits to having a local agency or local entity that can be more responsive to community needs. But unfortunately, I think what we have heard at Disability Rights California and from other channels too, there are communities that are not feeling heard, that are not feeling like their regional centers are hearing them, that are not effectively engaging in dialogue with them, specifically and especially communities of color. And it's not at every regional center, but there are certain regions and certain regional centers where this has been a persistent problem, where individuals and families are showing up, are protesting, are speaking out. And I would suggest that in those situations, if people are not feeling heard by their local regional center, then what is the purpose of having local control? If that is the goal of having more local agencies, that should be one of the things that's working well, and that should be prioritized if we're going to keep the model of having local agencies. And finally, one of the things that I'd like to talk about a little bit is the idea of decentralization, right? Which is what we're talking about when we're talking about regional centers, and the role that that plays in facilitating discretion. And one of the things that we've been thinking about at Disability Rights California is the role that discretion plays in the system. And Mr. Naaman was talking earlier about the tension, right, between standardization and uniformity on the one hand, and between discretion and local control and individualization on the other. There are benefits to both, but I think one of the problems in our current system is that the balance at this point, I think, has gone too far towards discretion. When you have a decentralized system, as we do in our state, every layer, every step where there is another point where you're delegating decision-making authority down is another point where discretion can be introduced. That can be used for good if you're using it to be extra responsive to your community, or you're using it to really individualize supports and services to someone with complex needs. But if it's not done with integrity, with intent, with alignment around a clear vision for what is most important, what is fundamental to the system, what disabled people need overall, basic human rights, basic civil rights, the types of things that were talked about in the Lanterman Act when it was first established long ago. If those things are not the guiding principle and the North Star, then that's where discretion can get us into trouble. We know from many other systems that unfettered discretion is where bias can creep in. I think what's happened is that bias has crept in because our pendulum has swung too far towards discretion without some baseline standards of what all disabled people are entitled to and should feel like they have, just as a minimum baseline. So I certainly don't want to throw out the idea of local control. I think there's a lot of good there, but I would suggest that much more work needs to be done, especially at the state level and specifically at the Department of Developmental Services, to bring our system more back towards a stronger hand, not towards standardization, but just to align around a common vision that we have not had this, I think, recently. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Martin, please.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to address Commissioner Sidley. She said that she's new to this. And Commissioner, I want to share with you that in addition to being a nonprofit leader and a civil rights lawyer, I'm also the parent of a son. His name is Marty, and he's on the autism spectrum. So I've been a consumer. I am at my family. We are consumers of Regional Center services. My son has been a consumer since he was 2 years old. This conversation is painful, to be honest with you, to listen to, because this fight to bring equity to the regional center system is more than a decade old. It is probably much older than that. I can only go back to when I began in this fight, and it dates back to as early as 2005, 2006, having sat on state commissions under Senator Darrell Steinberg, under Assemblymember Darrell Steinberg, and addressing these issues of disparities. It was 2011 when the LA Times did this major expose exposing the disparities in the regional center system. So we have been working on this same problem. And there's data that came out recently to say that we have not moved the needle on this problem despite having spent a lot of money. So I don't think, well, I hope that the Little Hoover Commission is not here to continue to put Band-Aids on a hemorrhage. This system does not work for poor people, does not work for Black people, does not work for Latinx people, it does not work for minoritized populations. Of course, we can point to some good examples. We can point to some programs, maybe in East LA Regional Center that's working. I'm sure we can find some great examples everywhere. But this conversation about disparities, systemic racism, systemic barriers has been an ongoing conversation now for decades. And we make a couple of, we take a couple of steps forward, we make a little progress, but overall, we have been unwilling to, as a state, to address these systemic issues and to reimagine this system so that it is working for everyone in the state. And we know that the majority of the people in our state are not wealthy people. They are working class, and unfortunately, in a big county like Los Angeles, a lot of poor people. So I just would hope that everyone comes to this with that understanding that we have been tinkering and putting Band-Aids on this problem now for a decade plus. So I wanted you to know that, Commissioner Singh. I also want to address this issue of local control and board members. One of the things that Special Needs Network does is we train parents. We've trained over 1,000 parent advocates to sit on boards. And many of our parent advocates have sat on regional center boards. They have gotten the best advocacy training you can get short of going to law school. And they all report back that it is such a daunting process to be a parent sitting on a professional nonprofit board with people with letters behind their names, with the executive director, with the team of that regional center. And those parents, despite the great training that we provided them, felt so unempowered. They felt powerless to speak up, to really drive change in those systems, because the same level of barriers that we're talking about at the DDS level exist at many of these local regional center, even at the board level. So we can talk about parents being on boards, we can talk about consumers, but what does that really mean? How much power do they really have as they sit on those boards, and are they able to really drive change at those boards? And if you look at the tenure of some of the executive directors at these regional centers, I would venture to say that a lot of these folks don't have a lot of power. Because despite the poor performance of many of the regional center, these directors stay for decades. And the last point I want to make is about this notion that somehow local control or local service models that work for local areas can only be accomplished under this current system, I think is a fallacious binary choice that we're creating. You can have local initiatives, you can address the differences of somebody in a rural part of the country, the county or state, versus someone that's in an urban part of the state, and still have a model where you're not giving billions of dollars to these 21 entities with the level of oversight or the lack of oversight that is currently built into this system. So I don't think we have to think of it as a zero-sum game or as a binary choice. We can achieve both, but equity is at the core of this. Well, we have to be talking about how do we get there? And these little fixes around the edges have not gotten us to equity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. We've got a number of hands raised now, so just to let everybody know the order we have coming up, Mr. Jardini, you're next, then followed by Mr. Ne'eman, Ms. Mark, Ms. Westling, Ms. Morantz, Dr. Harrington, and Dr. Aguilar-Gagiola.
Thank you, Ms. Foster. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to the Little Hoover Commission for putting this together. And I think Ms. Martin's comments are salient and on point. This is a great opportunity for us to take a look at what's working in the system, what's not working, and really focus on real solutions. So I represent providers in the system, and I think a lot of the comments that Ms. Martin spoke to regarding parents are things my members hear from their parents as well, right? So there are a lot of challenges in the system. We are at best, our system is truly an equitable one, right? Because we are based on the Lanham Act. It is all supposed to be driven by what the needs of the individuals are. We are unique in our space as a state with an entitlement to services. We are not meant to have waiting lists. We are supposed to have a vast network of service providers to meet the needs, the individual needs of individuals. So that is, when our system's working best, I think it's clear that there are gaps right now. I mean, both from a disparities perspective, but just even from an overall investment in the system. We are growing leaps and bounds. We have over 400,000 individuals that we are intending to serve in this calendar year or in this fiscal year. So there is a real question about, what the system's capacity is as it's currently constituted to meet those needs. I fully appreciate some of the comments from Ms. Westling on what regional centers do. And when things are working best, some of those individual local level elements and perspectives can be really helpful. But to Commissioner Emerson's point, I think Mr. Ne'eman touched on it as well in his comments around what's available to people and some of the barriers to service based on whatever catchment area you happen to have on. We're talking about solutions today. And I think one of the things that would be helpful, we certainly have a vendorization process that allows for some courtesy vendorizations in multiple regional centers. But a real challenge is making sure that services are available, not just based on your address where you live, but what the capacity of service providers might be to meet your needs. So one thing that we could push for as a system is maybe a statewide vendorization or something like that. Certainly over the last couple of years, we have seen a complete transformation of services in some cases, utilizing remote and other supports that is not necessarily dependent on where you are. And certainly as we've gotten towards a more community-driven system, it's not so necessary to focus on where an office home base of a provider is and what is their capacity to serve. So I think that there is an opportunity to do a better job serving more individuals if we open up and provide some more flexibility, particularly around where the service provision can happen, not necessarily so constrained by the barriers of those catchment areas, but really focusing on how we can meet the needs of people. Again, going back to that IPP and the core tenet of the Lanham Act, which is what do people need and how can we get them what they need? So wanted to bring that perspective today.
Thank you. Mr. Ne'eman?
Thank you. I want to respond to one of the commissioner's earlier questions regarding data, and then also make a few remarks in support of Ms. Hahn's point regarding discretion and the potential risks of it. So first, with respect to the data point, data on the number of individuals served, both objectively and as a percentage of the state's population, as well as data on state expenditures for people with IDD, is available from the University of Minnesota's Residential Information Systems Project. California has one of the highest numbers of persons with IDD served, not just in absolute terms, but also as a percentage of the state's population. But it's actually not necessarily the case that California spends more on a per individual basis, particularly when you take into account the state's large population and fiscal resources. When we look at California's expenditures on home and community-based waiver services for people with IDD per a state resident, it's actually well below the national average. California spends $86 per state resident for HCBS waiver services to people with IDD as compared to $130 nationally. I would say those figures are subject to some interpretation. For example, California may pay for some services that are paid for in other states via the waiver, via other financing vehicles, such as the IHSS program. But in looking at the data that's available, it does suggest that while there are a number of advantages California has relative to other states, most notably an entitlement, no waiting lists, and a relatively broad scope of eligibility, although there's room for improvement there. It is not the case that the state is spending more per resident than other states. It's in the bottom half in that regard. With respect to the earlier point on discretion, I want to echo Ms. Hahn on that, because I think the backdrop to this entire conversation has to be, well, there are many backdrops, but one of these backdrops has to be a recognition that the DD service system is changing, right? And it has changed before. The shift away from large state institutions towards home and community-based services is something that most of us should be very familiar with. That represented a very positive shift. It is a shift that is still ongoing. It still needs to be completed. There are still more institutions to close. But there are also, I think, ongoing efforts to take the next step and to recognize that at times, when we closed institutions, we took people from a large building where someone else controlled every aspect of their life, and we moved them to a small building where someone else controlled every aspect of their life. And so the sort of the cutting edge, the next step in DD services has been to shift away from other forms of congregate settings, such as many types of group homes, such as sheltered workshops, such as facility-based day hab. Again, this is a slow, gradual transition in many ways, and is going to take place over the course of many years towards individualized non-congregate settings, towards things like supported living services, supported employment services, day hab without walls, community-based day hab. And I would say that one of the most concerning forms of across regional center disparities we see is very different availability in those cutting edge services. It should not be the case that if you live in one regional center system, you are presented an option of group home A, group home B, group home C, and isn't it wonderful you have choices? And if you live in another regional center system, you potentially have the opportunity to be supported to live in your own apartment or to get assistance finding and keeping a job. And so I think it's important that we recognize that we have to be tracking accountability and disparities, both across regional centers and within regional centers, reflecting racial, income, socioeconomic disparities, not just in terms of dollars spent, but also in terms of access to these cutting edge non-congregate models of service provision, particularly because it is often the case in other contexts that those who end up in congregate placement are those who face the greatest form of marginalization along other dimensions, race, socioeconomic status. And we have reason to believe that is the case in the context of DD services as well. One more thing I would mention with respect to Ms. Martin's point. So I spoke earlier in favor of some degree of local management, and I think that's true. I think you do need, because of the complexity of DD services, you do need local infrastructure for case management and managing provider networks. But just to argue for limiting that discretion and argue for accountability and to balance that local control with accountability, I think it is, as Ms. Martin pointed out, a mistake to believe that relying on the regional center boards to provide that accountability is sufficient. It's something we've seen consistently in any number of other human service contexts. The balance of power really lies with the staff, who generally tend to have more access to information, more sophistication, more resources. There is certainly a need for a stronger role on the part of DDS to track outcomes and enforce accountability. There is also a need for greater resources to independent entities that sit outside of DDS and the regional centers in order to support them to hold regional centers accountable, inform families about and self-advocates about the scope of options available to them, and be a source of information and expertise to the members of those regional center boards, because otherwise we are simply leaving people to fend for themselves within contexts where unsupported, it is very difficult to make progress.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Sidley, I see you have a question, and let me just let the group real quick know the order of the next speakers. We have Ms. Mark, Westling, Dr. Morantz, Dr. Harrington, Dr. Aguilar-Gagiola, Ms. Walter, Mr. Capra, and Ms. Martin.
So 2 seconds here, mostly building on what Ms. Martin has said about the boards of directors. As a parent, as people who are living their life, to then be a volunteer on the board of directors and have to go through all that training, whatever. My actual thought when I asked the question is, should it be professionalized? Should these people be paid? So they're there. I have no idea as I'm thinking this through, but that is a tremendous amount of responsibility to be doing as a volunteer. And so it was just, that was the reason for my question and what I was probing there. And you sort of in many ways were proving my point to me, because it's very difficult to live your life, to be a parent, to do all the things you have to do to get your children fed in the morning, to get them off to school. And then to have all these people relying on you for your decision-making, and you're a volunteer, it does push the power down to the professional staff. And so I don't know the answer, but that was my thought behind the question. So with that, I know Ms. Mark, you're next, and I'll be quiet.
Thank you, Commissioner Sidley, because I was just going to talk about that. So that's a perfect lead in. We at DVU have spent a great deal of time thinking about boards of directors and the problems that exist inherently with the way that the system was designed 50-something years ago. And what we have found is that in many of the cases, regional center boards are handpicked by executive directors. And so therefore, there is a familiarity with that executive director in a way that doesn't allow for the kind of oversight that needs to happen. I can tell you that a number of years ago, there was a regional center that families were coming to us, particularly from the Latino community, saying that they're not getting services. And so our organization started showing up with them to support them at board of directors meetings to complain about the fact that the regional center wasn't providing services. And the boards of directors just sat there, listened, ignored them, and then moved on. So instead of not coming back, we came back with twice as many people the next meeting. And then the next meeting, we came back with 5 times as many people. And when they continued to ignore us, we started holding signs. And I went up to the chair of the board after one meeting, and I said, it is your job to hold the executive director accountable for the fact that there are such significant racial disparities in your regional center. And she said, well, we can't really hold our executive director accountable. And I said, no, you're actually the supervisor. She said, well, we're not actually the supervisor. And I said, no, you are literally the person's supervisor. She did not know, as the chair of the board, that she was the supervisor of the executive director. So how is that providing oversight? And so we need something different. And what I don't think we should do, Commissioner Sidley, is to take it away from families and self-advocates. I think we need to empower them. And we had actually had legislation that went nowhere, but we might see it in the future to have boards of directors first and foremost protected from any retaliation. This is to Commissioner Emerson's point, is that many boards of directors say to us, we're afraid to hold the executive director accountable because we're afraid we're going to lose our services or our family member services. You should not be living in fear and serving on your board, a board of an organization. So we need to protect them specifically, not just through the general, whistleblower protections. There needs to be specific protections laid out in law for board members to know that their services will not be cut if they serve on the board. Number one. Number two, we got to get the executive director out of the equation of selecting board members. They shouldn't be there. We have ideas floating around from everything from creating a separate, more community-based nominating committee to nominate boards of directors, all the way to having community elections that each person served at a regional center gets one vote for them or their designee, a family member, to vote for the board, so that the board understands they are actually accountable to their community and not to the executive director. And so I think there are ways to make them accountable without eliminating boards of directors, but I think that's critically important. I also wanted to talk about real quickly the conversation around local control and whether that's valuable or not. It is valuable, but when I think of local control, I think of local control as far as the person served, the person with the disability. They are the ones that should have control over their lives, over their services, over what they need. And if we don't have that ultimate local control, then it doesn't really matter if there are regional centers at the community level. And I know that I'm like one song person where I keep talking about the self-determination program, but I do believe that when people actually have choice and control over their lives, that outcomes improve, that when they can choose the person that serves them every day, instead of being told by the regional center, you're using one of these three agencies, which is what we were told when my son became an adult. I have a 25-year-old son with autism. We were given 3 horrible day programs for him to choose from, where he sat in a box all day and he didn't like any of them. I wouldn't have liked them either. And so, luckily my son is now in the self-determination program, and it is living his best life by choosing the staff that support him, by choosing what he does every day in the community, and being and gaining from those skills that he has gotten from making choices in his life. So as I think of local control, I think of it far less about regional centers being able to haphazardly make decisions about people's lives, and much more about the person themselves. Thank you.
Let me jump in here quickly. It looks like we have a question from Commissioner Cannella.
Yes, thank you. On the problem with the boards, you find that in every board, every city council, every board of supervisors, where you've got professional staff that know the language, they know how to work the system. I don't mean that in a bad way. And you've got volunteers or elected folks that just don't have that experience. And so that is a hard thing to overcome, even if you have elections for those board members. But I do have a question. So I don't think I've heard too many positive things about the regional centers and how they're operating. Is it, and Ari, maybe you can speak to this because you talked a little bit about the financial part, how, and maybe you mentioned it, and I'm sorry if you didn't, I missed it, but how underfunded are we? And is that the solution to fix it? I mean, would more money fix it, or is it a combination of more money and maybe of the regional centers being ran a little more efficiently?
Well, I think more money is definitely a role. It definitely has a role here. I mean, I think, rate setting is a factor in the workforce crisis, and a lot of the issues with service quality, not all of them, some of them relate to service model, but a lot of the issues with service quality come back to the fact that we have effectively made providing services to people with disabilities an employer of last resort, which is really a tragedy and terrible public policy. So I don't want to reject the role of more money. I do think more money has to be coupled with some degree of accountability, focusing, I would say, on these twin goals of systems transformation. So we have a lot of legacy infrastructure, and it can be very difficult to move away from legacy infrastructure, going back to that earlier point regarding shifting out of the group home sheltered workshop model towards the non-congregate model. It'd be very difficult to make those changes, in part because providers resist them. And so, in fact, there are likely regional center staff who would welcome more pressure from Sacramento to make those kinds of shifts, because it would give them a greater degree of leverage in pushing their provider networks. But I think in addition to that, there has to be more of a focus on acknowledging the role of within regional center disparities on the basis of race and socioeconomic factors and so on. I think the money is definitely a component. The accountability is definitely a component. One small argument I would make that I think is important to consider in the national perspective in favor of the regional center system. It is very fortunate that California has not proceeded down the path of capitation for these services. There are a growing number of states that are shifting intellectual and developmental disability services into managed care and shifting responsibility for those services into managed care plans. And while there are exceptions in many parts of the country, the results have been disastrous. Iowa saw a horrendous managed care rollout that particularly adversely impacted people with IDD. Kansas, a number of other states have run into those problems. I think we made a lot of criticisms of the regional center system today that are very well justified, but just to make one plug in its favor, it's very good that California has decided to keep these services carved out from Medicaid managed care. By and large, it's a very difficult process to do that well, and California should continue not to go down that road.
Commissioner Cannella, did you have a follow-up? I see your hand is still raised. All right. It looks like next we have Ms. Westling.
Yes, so I appreciate the great discussion, and I'm going to reference back to a few things that I've heard. So sorry if it appears disjointed, because I was rapidly writing notes as quickly as I could, and they're probably not in the best order. First, I want to go back to some of the discussion that Mr. Neiman was leading us through about system transformation, about where do we see the service system going. And I think we can spend a lot of time talking about some of the challenges we're encountering, but I think it's also important to recognize that we are moving to a more community integrated service delivery system. And the other step that we're taking in the state of California is beginning to more systematically measure outcomes rather than just the volume of service purchased, and better understanding how this service system impacts the lives of the people it serves. Because ultimately, that's the goal. It's not about keeping the status quo. It's about making sure that the services each person is receiving are responsive to their needs. And I think that one of the things I think back on is that Commissioner Eriner, during the hearing on the 13th, really highlighted that in a lot of ways, we have a dynamic tension in our system, because we do have an entitlement to services, which means that There aren't waiting lists to enter the service delivery system, but we don't have guaranteed dedicated funding to ensure that the system is adequately funded. And this has left us with a number of challenges. First is the inadequacy of the service provider network in terms of not enough people to do the critical work that needs to be done, and certainly not enough people to do it in an individualized way. Now, some of that is because of the workforce crisis that's in our, that's in our world right now, but some of that is endemic to our system because, as Mr. Neiman said, we've allowed the system to become the employer of last resort. The other thing that's important to note is that even beyond boards of directors, the most impactful way that people can control their own lives and control their own destinies and really shape their own service delivery is in their relationship with their service coordinator. And really, that's where the determination of service delivery starts, is in the identification of needed services and supports at the planning team level. And what we've done over the years is we've allowed caseload ratios, the number of people each service coordinator is supporting, to climb at the very same time we've bureaucratized the system. And so what we've done is peeled away the time to do the quality social work, case management, service coordination with each individual family and each individual served to really get to the core of what is it that they need and how can we best support them, including through accessing generic resources. We've done that at the very same time we've increased the paperwork and the administrative burden on these professionals. When the Lanterman Act was formed in 1969, the statute that described the functioning of regional centers in this service delivery system was 10 pages. Today it is over 400. And this is the source of a lot of the tension within the regional center workforce in terms of, I got into this service delivery system to help people. And I find that I spend a lot of time, a lot of my day carrying out necessary duties so that we can draw down federal funding. The good news is there was significant investment in reduction of caseload ratios in this fiscal year. We're continuing to work to better understand what is that total need, but it's important to recognize that each person's power comes from the planning team level. Additionally, Ms. Martin referenced the tenure of regional center executive directors. I've been with the Association of Regional Center Agencies for 10 years. And I can tell you that in that time, 17 of the 21 regional centers now have a different executive director than when I started. So there is turnover in those positions at this time. And I think a couple of other quick things, I don't mean to monopolize the conversation, but when we think about measuring outcomes, one of the critical things that we are starting to catch up on as a state is improving our data systems. Because in order to measure outcomes, that has to be done systematically and in a way that we can transparently communicate that information. Our data systems are so old that we lack the capacity to do that, but we are excited by the opportunity to begin working on those things. And then in terms of services that are responsive to each individual's needs, Ms. Mark references the self-determination program, which is fantastic. It gives people control over their own lives, over who is providing services, as well as what's called budget authority. So the ability to move dollars between different services. But there is also a service delivery model that's taken off more during the pandemic, and we're thrilled to see it, which is called participant-directed services, which enables individuals to select their own service providers, but they don't have that budget control that I know that Ms. Mark has talked about. And then when we think about the diversity of the state, we need to recognize that much of the work we've been doing, and I understand Ms. Martin's point that some of it feels like it's tinkering around the edges, but a lot of the work that's being done now is to better understand not only how to make our existing services more responsive to people from a variety of diverse backgrounds, and that could be racial or ethnic or linguistic or socioeconomic, as Mr. Neiman raised, but also how to create services that are more responsive to people's needs. One of the great opportunities in our system is the investment in bilingual stipends for those individuals who work directly with people, the direct support professionals, so that they can better support more diverse populations. And I think it's important to recognize that this is a system in transition and that it is working to build upon its historic strengths with an eye towards the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Morantz.
Thanks so much. I just want to build on a point that a couple of people have touched on already. Actually, Amy Westling just mentioned it in her mentioning our IT system and data collection. I think what is really striking about this, the conversation that's happened so far, is there's two very different visions of the regional center system. You know, there's the vision of a relatively decentralized system by design that is meant to be responsive to the communities that it serves. One in which, I don't remember her exact words, but that Amy Westling was just alluding to, one in which the relationship with the service coordinator is central and is the means to the end of promoting a lot of well-being among people being served. One in which regional center boards can be responsive to their local communities. And in which, to the extent that disparities exist, in large part, those disparities are probably relatively benign because of the fact, for example, that there's different compositions of the population in different catchment areas. For example, I think Ms. Westling mentioned that some regional centers might have a disproportionate number of people who are white that were exiting developmental centers, who are particularly costly to serve, and so that might sort of inflate the numbers. She also alluded to the fact that in different regional centers, there might be different sort of support structures or family, family structures that could affect those differences. And I think, that's one vision. And then on the other hand, we have a vision in which those kinds of disparities are really anything but benign and are actually indicative of combination of implicit bias, systemic racism, sort of those who scream the loudest getting served. And those are along racial and ethnic lines, along regional lines across regional centers. And even to the point that some people have suggested it's a broken system. I mean, that was one of the terms that was used several times in the last hearing, and I think we've heard at least once today as well. So even putting on the table the fundamental question of whether this system should be completely rethought and we should go back to the drawing board. I think what is so difficult about this conversation is that it rests on a lot of empirical assumptions about just the facts on the ground, about who is getting served and how, about outcomes and how they vary across different groups. And to pick up a point that in a different context, Arina Eman mentioned about the legacy infrastructure, we have a decades old IT infrastructure that is simply not up to the task of answering these critical empirical questions about whether the disparities we've been discussing in both of these hearings are really a cause for concern, or whether, and again, this is the story that Amy Westling was telling, when you control for things like whether people are living at home or not, or whether they're exiting a developmental center, or whether they have extended family in the area or not, or whether they're living at home or not, that they look much more benign. And so I really cannot underscore enough the critical urgency of overhauling this legacy IT structure, because we're simply never going to know the answer to these empirical questions until we do so. And so we can talk about equity, autonomy, and accountability all day long, but until we actually have the data systems in place to measure those things and try to understand cause and effect using the tools of empirical social science, then we're just not going to be able to resolve them, and we might misdiagnose the problem and therefore come up with the wrong solutions. And so I just want to talk a little bit more with a little bit more concreteness about what I think that kind of system would look like. Since although it's been alluded to, I don't think in either of the hearings so far, it's really been discussed in too much detail. So, and really, I guess the all-encompassing theme would be transparency. We've heard that word a number of times, but it's a really robust kind of transparency. You know, one in which you're really designing the system in such a way so that you can figure out what's working and what isn't, and which kinds of disparities might be relatively not concerning because they can be explained by other factors. You realize you're not comparing apples to apples, and which kind of disparities are really so important they should become top policy priorities. I mean, I think three features of I guess I could call it I'm inclined to call it a person-centered kind of IT infrastructure, although we could maybe think of a different term. Three hallmarks of such a system that do not exist now that I want to highlight, I think are worth considering. First of all, the system as it exists now basically makes it impossible to track individual outcomes over time. Now, that's not quite true. In theory, DDS could track individual outcomes over time. In theory, regional centers could track individual outcomes over time. In reality, they don't actually do so in any systematic way. But in terms of sort of formal program evaluation, or sort of, again, the tools of social science, of analyzing data to understand changes over time, it's a completely opaque system. It's amazingly opaque. It's one of the most opaque systems I've ever heard of. I mean, there's no part of the federal government that is as opaque as the system. And so it's impossible to track outcomes over time, essentially. Again, it's completely closed off to the social scientific community. And some of the reasons for that have been mentioned in passing have to do with individual privacy, or, you know, concern that if you raise the specter of people's information being made available to anybody, even sort of social scientists, that would scare people off. All I can say about that is the entire federal government has managed to do so. So I'm cautiously optimistic that if those privacy concerns have been addressed by pretty much every federal agency, there's some way that California can figure out a way to do it, consistent with, you know, confidentiality and privacy concerns. So tracking individual outcomes over time is absolutely vital, because unless we can do that, we can't figure out in any meaningful way whether particular interventions are working or aren't working. For example, the tens of millions of dollars that have been spent already to address disparities. If we can't track individual outcomes over time, we can't know whether those programs are helping the communities, the underserved communities that they're designed to serve. Secondly, we need to track subjective as well as objective outcomes, and that's absolutely critical. We need to track things like employment, health, morbidity. I mean, a lot of sort of objective outcomes that we all think are important, where people live, how long they live. But we also need to track subjective outcomes. How do people feel about their lives? How much autonomy do they experience day to day? How much control do they have over where they work, with whom they work? If they receive support in the home, who is providing that support? So the outcomes that we study need to be much more robust than they are now. And there's a couple sort of national measures, that one in particular that is designed to track subjective measures, but it's not available at the individual level. It's not available at all, except in the aggregate. So it's not really very useful, again, for any kind of program evaluation or tracking trends over time. And finally, most importantly, we need to track the outcomes that align with the problems that we've been talking about, with the deficiencies in autonomy and equity and accountability. And so we need to really define the measures more broadly, more systemically and comprehensively, that are going to enable us to figure out if we're doing something right or if we're doing something wrong. And so just again, with a little bit more concreteness, in terms of autonomy, I'm going to list some things we cannot currently measure. There's no way to answer these questions right now with the current system that I think is absolutely vital to measure. So just a few examples. to what extent are different people controlling for a lot of factors, accessing settings that are compliant with what Arina Eman mentioned before, the Medicaid's final settings rule, which is really designed to help people have significant control in their day-to-day lives, both at home and at work. So to what extent are people's access to those settings varying by race and ethnicity, or for that matter, by regional center, controlling for a lot of other factors? Another example, how does participation in the self-determination program, which we've discussed a lot, vary by race and ethnicity, or by regional center, controlling for a lot of other factors that might sort of confound the comparison, like the one that Amy Westling mentioned before, such as, family constellation. Those are things we can track. That's another really important question to answer. We don't know the answer to. What about utilization of supported decision-making, which is a really critical tool to promote choice and autonomy for people with IDD? What about actual participation in the individual IPPs, in the plans that people and meetings that determine people's access to services and supports and their goals and dreams that are, that to which those are the means, or self-reported levels of choice and control. So all of those things under kind of this rubric of autonomy, many of which we've discussed, those are things we could track if we had a IT infrastructure, a person-centered IT infrastructure that was actually measuring those things, so we can measure them over time. And
Dr. Morantz, I'm gonna jump in here just a little bit because we're running short on time, and I want
thank you.
Sure
Thanks so much.
Haven't had a chance to talk or able to.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Harrington.
Well, I want to just say that I agree with Alison, but that we need a much better system for measuring what's going on. On the other hand, I want to also make the point that California has one of the better data collection systems. The problem is it's just not utilizing it properly. I mean, we have extensive need data on every single client, and yet that's not used to help determine what services people get. And and it's also not used for allocating resources. So obviously, if someone has severe needs, they're going to need more resources than someone who has mild, less needs. And so we need to use what we have and then build on it to add these other components, which also I should mention, it should include preferences for services, which we don't have any data on. So I think that need and preferences are the two most important things, and we're not looking at those. And I also want to agree with Ms. Martin that a study that we did at UCSF using 2005 data showed these huge disparities on service use and service expenditures for all racial and ethnic minority groups. And we controlled for need, the characteristics of the client, and we showed the disparities. Then we showed this again in 2013. And now we could look at it again if we had the need data, which the department keeps their data systems into 3 separate files and doesn't want anybody looking at it. But if you look at the statistics that the department does put out, when white clients get $28,000 a year and Hispanic clients get $12,000 a year, that can't be benign. That's not, it's a gross discrepancy. And even if you took into account need, there's no way you could explain how that discrepancy could be happening. And yet it seems to be worse than it was in 2000, using the 2005 data. So something's really wrong. And I just going to the issue of, decentralized or, what kind of a system we have. you can build in standard requirements regardless of whether you have a decentralized or a centralized system. There's no reason to allow these kind of discrepancies to exist. And you could also have vendors set up at the state level. They don't have to be set up at the regional level. You could change the composition of the board so that it could be 100% consumers instead of 20% consumers, where they're going to be totally intimidated by the other people. So there's many structural changes that could be made, but I think a lot of those would have to be made by the legislature. So I'm very glad that the commission is looking at this, and obviously we could go on all day about what kind of changes, but I also want to put a plug in for the self-determination. I mean, if you set up need categories, say you have 5 need categories, you could set up a certain amount of money for each of those need categories and give that to the client, to each client. And basically, this is what is done in England. And there's no reason we have to have this Byzantine control over what clients have. I mean, if each client had $15,000 on average, and they could decide what services they wanted, and the regional centers or whoever could help put a package together, that makes sense to me. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Aguilar Gagiola, pardon me.
Thank you, Tamar. And I'm very glad that the Little Hoover Commission, which I respect a lot, is focusing on this particular work, because for what I've been hearing, and it's fascinating that the comments and the discussion, this needs to be focused on what's happening, because these disparities that you had been talking about had been for decades. This is nothing new. It had been documented. Dr. Harrington just presented, the data briefly of 2005, then in 2012 or 13. That's very, very impressive, but that happened. That has happening for quite some time now. I just want to bring to your attention that back in 2011, 2012, Ms. Areva Martin and I co-chair a task force that was called the Senate Task Force on Equity and Diversity. It was comprised of 20 task force members that included consumers, families, advocates, experts, providers, regional center staff, community-based organization leaders, etc. And it was expanded to 50 members, 30 of whom were nationwide experts. And we worked very hard for a while. And the task force created 5 work groups that focused on, and I'm very pleased that Dr. Morantz and talk about outcome measures, which is of critical importance. But one of the work groups was precisely on performance and outcome measures that focus on equity and diversity, and another work group on best linguistic and cultural competency practices. We created a report that was called the Report by the Task Force on Equity and Diversity for Regional Center Autism Services. And there are recommendations that report came up with, both for the regional centers, the focus was on regional centers, but also on the Department of Developmental Services as well. Very, very concrete. And what is fascinating to me is that some of the discussion that we're having here are captured, are included in those recommendations. And I don't know, Ms. Westling, if you are familiar with that report. It was a landmark report, I thought. And really did a lot of work on outcome measures, because I think accountability emerged at that time with a strong force. By the way, I'm a father with a son with Asperger's, and he's 33 now. He, thanks to my wife, primarily, he was diagnosed early in life, and we were able to do many things and have continued. This is a lifelong, commitment, and that truly has sensitized me. In addition of being a researcher, that's one of my primary identities. So, two things that I want to mention. One is that would love for all of you and the commission, if you're not familiar with that report, to take a look at it, because it has a chapter specifically on performance measures, which also align very much with Dr. Morantz, wonderful comments that resonated very much with me. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. It is a lot of that is already organized in a manner that it seems to me. I went back to the report. I look at the recommendations, look at the summaries before I came here, and I said, "Oh my God, this continues to apply, maybe even more," because I wouldn't be surprised, for example, that what Dr. Harrington mentioned, the disparities that they found in 2005 and in 2012, if I heard correctly, were even worse. That right now, because of COVID, maybe even worse now. And I think we need to know, and we need to have a finger on the pulse, so we are in a position to move the needle. One last thing that I want to mention, and that is a lot of these challenges are related to access to the services. I'm a researcher. I'm the director of the Center for Reducing Health Disparities, and I have devoted a great deal of my life in the health equity space and mental health equity space. And I can tell you that with populations like Latinos and African Americans and other populations, one of the biggest challenges is access to care, that there are tremendous disparities in access and also on utilization of services. So I wonder, as we are venturing in other areas, if the regional centers are in a position now to go to where people are, not to be on the waiting mode, as usually happens, waiting for those in need of services to come to them, as opposed to them to go to where the needs are. I think digital health equity is especially after the pandemic, is happening. It's happening with historically underserved populations, vulnerable populations, and I don't see why this wouldn't be happening with members with developmental disabilities. One last thing, and that is, as I said, I reviewed the report and the recommendations. Under Chapter 5 of the report that we produced, and the chapter on performance and outcome measures on issues of equity, diversity, and cultural linguistic competency. At that time, Senator Darrell Steinberg said something that continues to be present right now. And I want to share that with you. And I quote, "This system of regional centers must be outcome-based and outcome-focused. If we are going to reduce disparities, if we are ever going to make a dent, we need to hold the centers and the state accountable for making progress. Make the system outcome-driven, and that will drive change. It will drive cultural change. It will drive a reduction in these disparities, and it will lead to better outcomes." And I think that continues to be as relevant as it was when that Senator Steinberg said it 10 years ago. That was in April of 2012. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Walter?
Thank you so much for having me here today. I appreciate the conversation and the extensive knowledge, the body of the panelists and the commission. This is such, I serve as the Chief Equity Officer at the Department of Developmental Services. This is in the last few years, the efforts that the department has put forward didn't begin with me. They started many years ago. And as Areva noted, which I completely agree with, the effort to reduce disparities is a long-standing effort. And it didn't begin in the last decade. In fact, I would argue that it began decades ago, when the system was built with a vision in mind that didn't necessarily include all of the communities that we are looking to serve today. First and foremost, as I perceive the work that I do in my division, equity is the lens by which I see our system. So there isn't a day that goes by that I'm not looking to find ways, not just in policy, but in communication with the people that we are trying to reach. That may be through a cultural specialist meeting. That may be through the monthly community-based organization meeting. It may also be through our African American focus group or our service access and equity focus group. The aspect for me and for the department is first and foremost to listen. And part of the reason why I took the time today to hear from so many of you is that I'm learning in this process too. The department doesn't have all of the answers today, which is why I find the commission's work to be so invaluable. That hearing from Alison Morantz and Areva Martin and Judy Mark, so many that have spent decades in our system trying to find ways and solutions to reach the number of individuals that the system has not always reached in the way it should be. And I have to say, you know, the work that we have done in the last several years, it requires us to have a multifaceted approach. It is not one particular methodology that we have found success with. And when I say success, it is not always in the data. Sometimes it's in the conversation. I know that Judy Mark this year in our Service Access and Equity Grant Program launched an amazing program to empower self-advocates. That is not a project we've ever had before. And can at this moment I measure the exact outcome or the success of that project? Probably not, admittedly not. But can I look at that project and say, that is an opportunity for us to lift the voices of a self-advocate from a diverse community somewhere in California. And that individual can help to inspire, teach, or help us learn about what is needed from a self-advocate's perspective. Areva Martin's project in our Service Access and Equity Program, amazing effort to reach our early start and our communities of color and trying to educate and empower families. Those are opportunities that are not always measured perfectly in POS. They're often measured in the stories and the conversations and the meaningful engagements that we have with communities that I wish the data always told the perfect story. I know that it does not. I have spent almost 20 years of my life working at Disability Rights California representing families. I come to this table as a Native Hawaiian woman with a mother who taught me how to advocate and support for the love of my brother who has served in the system, who's an adult that I help to support today. The lens by which she saw our system is, she would say the word, it is somewhat maha'oi. And that term means it is nosy. It is nosy for who I am and my family and my culture. My mother was born and raised in Hawaii. And the one thing that she said is government always the best way to think about how we love and support our loved ones that may have a disability? I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that the lens by which we each of us see this system depends on the vantage point in our experience in life. And I have to say, lifting up the voices and I think it was Ms. Hahn who spoke about lifting up the voices. That is one of the focal points of the work that we're doing at the department. Not only meeting, we meet with over 65 organizations monthly. And I want the commission to know that we're not just listening, we're engaging. So we're having dialogue about policy, about implementation, the struggles with programs like self-determination. Those aren't dismissed. Those are actually discussed in moments when a government agency, like of course, the department, but we have cultural specialists, we have directors that participate, we have community-based leaders from the Latinx community, the African-American community, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Korean, monthly. There's nothing that I would say in those meetings that is not considered valuable. It's namely, sometimes the conversation is not perfectly supportive. In fact, often our conversations, we're learning about what's not working. So I think just to circle back on what I think it was Mr. Neiman said, empowering community-based organizations. And I think it was something that I wanted to mention. Our grant program is not intended to be the Hercules of our entire system of inequities. It is intended to be an opportunity for grassroots organizations to have the opportunity, including regional centers, to have the opportunity to do something creative, to do something purposeful that meets the needs of a particular community. Those are not perfect. Those projects, year after year, what I learn from them is far more than what comes out in a report or in a data. I learned from the Korean community in Kasich that having early start materials all in Korean developed by that organization in partnership with the regional center, that's valuable.
Ms. Walter, I apologize, Ms. Walter, I'm going to stop you here because we're going to have a chance to hear from the department at the next hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Capra, we haven't had a chance to hear from you yet, and I see we have a comment from, or another question from Commissioner Emerson. I just want to let the group know we only have a little over 10 minutes left before we need to go to public comment. So one thing I'd like to do is encourage everybody, if you're willing to submit some written comments to the commission to follow up on the discussion here today, because obviously there's a lot of great ideas being shared, and I think more detail to get into. So let me ask Mr. Capra to join in the conversation for the first time today. Thank you, Mr. Capra, and then Commissioner Emerson, let's get to your question.
Okay, thank you so much, and I'll be brief, and it's just really to underscore the prior points about the importance of having valid and reliable data, and also going towards transparency and accountability on not just the regional centers, but the department as well. And I want to provide one example. So I've been looking at the public data now for 6 years through support through the Lucille Packard Foundation for children with special healthcare needs. And I've issued 4 reports and looking at the data relevant to the child populations, 0 to 2 and 3 to 21-year-olds. Who are, for which all that data has been posted online by the regional centers. And what has been most startling, one of the most startling key findings in this data that I found is that there's extreme variance in how the population is classified. We have 2 regional centers, for example, that are 61 miles apart from one another. And yet one has upwards of 89, almost 90% of its child population, its early start population, categorized as other ethnicity, and the other one has just over 5%. And that's just, to me, is just a startling, drastic range on that spectrum. And in looking at all the various regional centers websites, I found 3 different definitions to categorize their consumer populations and what constitutes an other ethnicity. So it really seems to be all over the place. There really needs to be uniformity. The one regional center identified that it had overclassified its other population. It had worked hard to try to bring those numbers down, but yet we have other ones where that population base has in some case tripled in the last 6 years. So I think in order for us to move forward, and especially with many of the things that Dr. Morantz mentioned, fundamentally, we all have to, there has to be one definition of this group, and it has to be captured accurately and consistent really with the US Census data, if that be the case. I mean, looking at the US Census data, which I also did, it still didn't match up with what is being reported out there. So it's very disconcerting. I think we have yet another regional center that has decided to bifurcate Filipinos from the Asian community, report separately on that, when that hasn't been done in 6 years, but yet here we are this year and that's happened. They've switched the authorization columns with the expenditures columns, which has yielded utilization rates beyond 100%. So we don't even have valid data that's out there with some of these regional centers. And again, can the regional centers self-regulate better on this? And even more importantly, where is the department to step up and provide more quality assurance management with respect to how this data is being reported? A lot of the disparity reduction community-based organizations rely on this data to submit requests for proposals to be able to access these funds. I mean, this was sort of the way forward here, was to have these disparity reduction projects. Well, I can tell you in the last fiscal year, there were 108 active disparity reduction projects, according to the department. Of those, only 7 were targeted towards this other ethnicity population, which is only 6% of the overall whole. And in my analysis, the other ethnicity population is at the lowest strata among all age groups in terms of per capita expenditures, and they're near the bottom in terms of no purchase of services. I mean, they don't have anything authorized to them in the first instance. And their utilization rates of what has been authorized and what they were able to yield from that by way of getting that service actually spent is among the lowest. So we really need to grab a hold of the steering wheel here and get better data, more fidelity, and more commitment from the regional centers and the department so that the public has valid data, and as well as the department as it's going forward and trying to work through systemic solutions. It's important that everybody be literally and figuratively on the same page. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Capra. Commissioner Emerson?
I want to thank everyone who participated today. You have provided us with some great information. And what I would like to do is have Ms. Walter address the issue about how does DDS determine what is working and is not working, and we can have that discussion at our next meeting on the 10th. But I'd like to know how the department determines what programs are working and what programs are not working. And to Ms. Martin, I would hope you could address in writing to us how a program of oversight would look in your eyes as a mother of a consumer and a member of a regional center program. We'd like to have that information. If you could write that down and send it to us. But I just want to say a great big thank you to everybody. This was very informative, and I appreciate the participation today. Thanks.
All right, I think actually on that note, we should move into public comments. I just want to reiterate again that there's so much to discuss here, and I still see several raised hands. So please feel welcome to follow up with me directly or submit written comments to the commission. All of that is appreciated and will be considered. And thank you again. I'd like to reiterate Commissioner Emerson's thanks here for joining us today. So Ashley, if you could put up the instructions for public comment. All right, for those of you who have been listening to this conversation, thank you also for joining us today. If you are joining us on Zoom, please use the raised hand feature to indicate that you would like to make a comment, and that will put you into the queue. If you've joined by phone, please send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. That's on the screen if you're able to watch it along as well. Please indicate the phone number from which you've called so that we know who to unmute. We will be calling on individuals in the order that requests are received. And when it's your turn to speak, you will be unmuted. I'd like to remind everyone that public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker for a total of 30 minutes. This is customary for commission meetings. We will have an additional opportunity for public comment at our November 10th hearing in just a couple of weeks. And again, we welcome additional feedback by email at any time. So Ashley, could you let us know, are there any members of the public who have indicated they wish to speak?
Yes, we do. We're going to start off with Rick Hodgkins. Rick, I'm turning on your ability to allow you to talk.
Oh yeah, now I'm muted.
Yes, my name is Rick Hodgkins. Let me say that in addition to being a member of Capital People First, which is an organization run by and for the IDD community covering the city and county of Sacramento, I am also in the STEP agency program which provides employment, independent living, mobile crisis, supported living, and tailored day services which provides both educational supports outside the college classroom and also provides employment and on-the-job training for clients. Also, I'm a member of the Lanterman Housing Alliance that advocates for statewide housing needs. And I'm also a member of the CalAIM, California Advancing and Innovating Medi-Cal Managed Long-Term Services and Supports Stakeholder Group. I just want to say one thing. Based on what I heard both at the last hearing as well as this hearing, I just want to say that while I'm very pleased and thankful with the budget gains in both last year's budget as well as in this year's budget, the message that was made clear in the from the 2008-9 state budget and going forward was that the general fund cannot bear the burden of not only regional center services but IHSS and Medi-Cal. So that therefore we need to do what we did going back 6 years, and that is to not levy a temporary tax on all managed care plans, not just Medi-Cal managed care plans, but also commercial managed care plans. For those of you who were in the legislature 6 years ago, back in 2016, if you recall that 28 years ago, back in 2014, President Obama issued an executive order that says that you can no longer just levy a tax on managed care plans which contract with Medicaid. You also need to levy it on managed care plans that are on the commercial side. We need to do that on the commercial side as well. Once again, that the general fund can no longer bear the burden. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Hodgkins. Ashley,
Great. Oh. Yes, we do. Next, we're moving on to Jenny. Jenny, you now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tina Flores Harshman, and I'm part of Jenny's Helpers. And I'm a parent advocate. I've been in 3 different regional center catchment areas with my daughters. And they are all, they're both on the autism spectrum. I just want to say, one of the things when we talk about these disparity issues, it very much has to do with the regional center and those who they hire to be service coordinators, supervisors, and management. In being in the 3 regional center catchment areas that I had, first one was Orange County when my kids were younger, got little to no services. And at that time, their service coordinator, that one of them that we'd had that left really quickly, her comment to me was, if I wanted more services for my children, I needed to separate from my husband and be single, because that's the only way you got services. Didn't do that. Instead, I contacted my legislator, made him aware of that comment. And then when we moved up into Valley Mountain Regional Center, I made the mistake of filing a 4731 complaint and going to fair hearings when we weren't getting services. That, pardon for the lack of a better way of saying it, put us on their do-do list. And they just, for 6 years that we were in that catchment area, couldn't get services. And to give you an example of the managing supervisor for our case at that time, we were looking for after-school care for my one daughter. Her comment to me was, well, I wish my children were disabled so I could get that service. And she just went on a parade of anything we wanted, couldn't get it. We finally moved into Far Northern Regional Center, and we are currently here now. They have done a superb job. We have finally got services, finally got things for my daughters. My daughters now, or my girls are all adult. 35 years, or my oldest one is 35 years old, and it's made a big difference for us. So some of these disparities that there needs to be some accountability. I couldn't go to anybody about the other 2 to really get stuff done about not having services, and the horror stories I could tell you about the ones, you know, you really need to start talking to some of us parents about what's happening here in those regional centers that aren't working. And I will also love to highlight Far Northern and how great they have been doing so far. And I hope to continue to have a very good working relationship with them and, you know, here on. So, but yeah, that is one of the disparity issues that I don't see and hear enough about that happens when the people working at the regional centers aren't working, or they get jealous and they want what you have. It's like, what you have to have a disabled kid. You know, I can't even.
If you could just wrap up your
that's what I just wanted to make sure. Some of these things that we have, that you start listening to the community and finding out how to hold them accountable. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, we're moving on to Connie Lappin. Connie, I'm turning on the ability to allow you to unmute yourself.
All right, it's my husband, Harvey Lapin.
Again, hi, my name's Dr. Harvey Lapin. I'm the proud father of a 54-year-old challenge of autism. And I want to thank the Little Hoover Commission again for doing this. And Dr. Harrington, you're there. We go back just about 50 years ago. Okay, I hope you remember me. But, you know,
Thank you for self-determination.
Right. To me, this has always been a civil rights movement. People want to be self-determined to the best of their ability. There's no question in my mind. And a lot of the things I'm hearing again and again over 50 years I've been an advocate are still happening. I think, and I have to say this, self-determination will address a lot of those problems. There's no question about it, because you have to have a person-centered plan, individualized, and you have to have a budget. That's it. And you don't have the money in your hand. You have a fiscal management service, but you can direct that money. I think it was Chief Justice Supreme Court Louis D. Brandeis said, you cannot have freedom without having being in charge of your money, financial. I hope through this that when we go back to the table and we look at only 2,000 people in it in 3 years, the first year there were supposed to be 2,500. Hasn't even happened yet.
2013.
Okay, we need timelines, and I say this, keep it in the system, but separate it out. It will be polluted if it stays in the system. And put timelines on it, because other states have it. Michigan, that's our home. Connie and I went to the University of Michigan. Okay, and affirmative action is a big thing there. We need to address disparity. People will get a person-centered plan. They have to if it's separated out, and they will get a budget. A lot of people don't even have a budget. The Lanterman Act, who we knew, Connie and I, Uncle Frank, I will say this. The intention here is equality, and we're not going to get it in a traditional, in my opinion, in a traditional system. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, we're moving on to Richard. Richard, you now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Hello, this is Richard Gallo from Santa Cruz, California. I'm a former advocate, respite worker, direct support professional, parent educator to parents of children with intellectual disabilities and behavioral problems. I would like to say that disparities need to be taken care of and can be taken care of at the staff level within the regional center. As the mother has stated, that is part of the problem right there with the intake worker, the intake team, the IPP service coordinator, or the IPP team. I have witnessed and noticed these kind of things that should have never happened within the regional center system. The other issue that I'm having, that I'm working with the Developmental Disabilities Services Central Coast region with families, is having issues of their child or adult child with mental health and intellectual disabilities. The piece of the problem that they're having is access to treatment and services relating to the mental health piece. They're going back and forth between the counties and the regional center. This needs to be taken care of for the sake of the consumer, for the sake of the family. It is destroying families by not getting the help the families need. I believe that the commission can make a positive impact in directing the Department of Developmental Services to do what they need to do and streamlining the reporting with all the regional centers into one document so that you can keep track what's being spent, who's being spent, and dealing with the disparities issues that's happening within the regional center. And thank you, commissioners, for your work. And you have a great panelists with expertise and knowledge that you can utilize their feedback to enhance a better system for our consumers and families. I am a volunteer with Cal Voices, Access California, a project of Cal Voices. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Ashley, it looks like you're muted.
For April?
Oh, I'm sorry. I am. Yes, April. Please begin your public comment.
Hi, my name is April Vincent, and I'm a mother of a son with intellectual disabilities and autism. And I really appreciate having this moment for hearing everybody that's speaking, especially the parents. And I'm a parent advocate for special needs, parents advocate for people with disabilities. And I think that piece of this portion of all the things that we talked about is very imperative. I think because you're missing the point of the parent side and the people that are guardians and involved. I don't see that highlighted enough through regional. I actually ran across this meeting because I'm involved with the Lucille Packard side of health services, and I'm one of those parents, as well as his dad. I should give him some a comment, a positive comment about him, as well as been instrumental in our son's success. But if I didn't at least be that type of parent to be persistent, like I have been within my son's life throughout his years of being with regional, it would have never been successful. Desmond has been highlighted very substantially throughout his life. So now we have a lot of parents come to us. But I really wanted to share, like, for instance, the things that go on as far as the boards. A lot of us parents don't know this. And I feel I'm pretty educated, and I get involved with my city councils. I do all those kinds of things. If my son doesn't get it, I find out how to get it. If he wants it, I find out if he can do it or not. He pushes me to that limit, and I'm thankful that my son has gifted me with that. But a lot of parents don't know this. So they come to other resources and other places. One of the other professors did mention about going into the communities, meeting them where they're at. Absolutely. I was a part of Promise Neighborhood on the board for that within the city of Hayward. It was successful because we met people where they were. A lot of them didn't know it. They were second language. I'm not second language, but I had a heart and a passion. I understood where they were coming from. And we went there and we found out, we researched, we even got data on that to find out what the need is. Please utilize your parents, your guardians. I feel that sometimes regional feels, or should say, it gives me the impression as if they only want us to get engaged so far. If we want to ask more questions, if we want to do more, we want to find out more, like being on a board or anything, we don't know that. We don't know where to go. We feel that maybe they don't want us to know more information. And that's concerning. So like I said, I'm a persistent parent about that. So I tend to find out for myself. I shared actually your event with several chat areas and pool areas that I communicate with.
Your time is up now. If you could just wrap up briefly, thank you.
Yeah, so no problem. So, and I'd like to let Leilani from DDS know that I did try to see if I could be involved with one of their boards, and nobody got back to me. So there are a lot of us that really are passionate and really want to help this situation and not just have meetings. And you can actually use us, as, like you said, volunteers, that we would maybe get some of these things done and solutioned and not just be sitting at meetings all the time for everybody. And that's my, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, April. Next, we're moving on to Lulu. Lulu, you now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Sí, buenas tardes. Me gustaría saber cómo van a ayudarme a traducir, por favor. Y mi comentario es, yo pertenezco al Centro Regional de Orange. Mi hijo es un adolescente del Centro Regional. La dificultad más grande es la antipatía de los centros regionales para tratar con los latinos. Solicitamos que sea auditado el Centro Regional de Orange para descubrir por qué la discriminación hacia los latinos, ya que cada año se refleja en las múltiples reportes de disparidad. Solicito en mi nombre y en el de la comunidad hispana que se den los fondos para que sea traducida la ley Lanterman a español, para poder conocer todos los derechos que están violando de nuestros hijos. A la comisión de Little Hoover le agradezco su apoyo, le agradezco que esté tomando este tema y también le pido su apoyo para que tengan un traductor a español calificado en la siguiente reunión, ya que nos interesa seguir aprendiendo con ustedes y seguir escuchando. El día de hoy no pudimos, todos los que hablamos español no tuvimos la oportunidad de estar con ustedes, de escuchar lo que ustedes dijeron, y es muy lamentable. Así que ojalá, por favor, designen fondos para tener traducción la siguiente vez. Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lulu. Next, we're moving on to Susan. Susan, you now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Hi, my name is Susan Goodpasture, and I'm Maidu and Paiute and a member of the Susanville Indian Rancheria up in Northern California. Also the mother of an autistic daughter who does receive services from the regional center. I'm also the founder and executive director for Acorns to Oak Trees, which is a tribal nonprofit organization that provides education outreach to tribal communities on IDD. I would definitely agree that there needs to be more oversight of regional centers to address the issues raised today and standardize vendorization. I think that that would definitely help. However, I do want to attest to the department's responsiveness to service access and equity barriers. I'm from a population that has historically been underserved across the board and has spent literally my entire career advocating for our communities in other arenas, specifically child welfare. And I will tell you that this is the first state agency who has not only acknowledged the inequity and the challenges that exist for our people, but has taken drastic change to correct it, between, adding money in the state budget to do targeted outreach for our communities, and really providing multiple platforms for myself and others to advocate and make our voices heard about these service access and equity barriers that exist for our Native families. We are a recipient of the Service Access and Equity Grant Program that Leilani was talking about. And I will tell you, it is just one grant program, but the changes that are being made because of just this small little grant that I was awarded it's having a huge ripple effect. No one is better equipped to serve our people or to reach our people than our people. And I will say that DDS has made it possible for me to create extremely meaningful change and has empowered me to be part of the change I want to see in the system. I will say that I would never rely solely on a regional center or a state agency to meet the needs of my daughter with special needs. And these are the conversations that I've had with the state. But it has been my experience with the department that they are responsive to the needs of the families and the communities that they serve, and genuinely want to include them in the discussions that will lead to systemic change. And that's what I would encourage, others on this call today, because I've experienced a lot of the same frustrations that you have, but we need to empower those people within our community who are equipped to be part of that change. And the state agencies, which I believe that they are doing, need to equip us to be part of that change. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you, Susan. Next, we're moving on to Christiana. Christiana, you now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Hello, my name is Christiana Morales. I'm an independent facilitator, a parent of a self-determination participant, a self-determination program local advisory committee member, and a regional center client for 17 years. I wanted to address the DDS July 28th directive regarding independent facilitation. The WIC code states participants can utilize the services of an independent facilitator of his or her own choosing. And this directive infringes on that participant's choice by limiting it to only independent facilitators that are vendored by the regional center. And I'm aware of the independent facilitator concerns and DDS concerns, but I want to make sure that the participant's right to choice is being acknowledged and addressed. And when choice is infringed upon, the people in diverse groups suffer the most. If regional centers do not vendor agencies that speak their language or have an unconscious bias, it continues to expand disparity and access to the self-determination program. I have a recommendation. I don't like to just complain. I believe that a third option could be created that would offer participant-directed services for an independent facilitator, which would work similar to how respite services are currently offered. This would include make it federally reimbursable, provide oversight through a financial management service, and most important, preserve the participant's choice. And I understand this committee is focused on big picture issues, and this may appear to be a specific administrative issue, but I feel there's a larger picture here. This is a single example of an issue, if resolved, could impact disparity. The current players have created an environment for disparity to flourish, and there needs to be changes in order to alter the current situation to make sure that participants' voices are in the forefront. Disparity issues may not only be solved with sweeping changes, but a series of small changes. And the data is in. Disparity exists. And the issue is, are we asking the right questions with the data? And are those questions coming from the participants? Thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you, Christiana. Next, we're moving on to Carl. Carl, you now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Actually, is he muted on his end, Mr. Vincent? There you are, Mr. Vincent. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I finally got it. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody is well. I just want to say this has been a tremendous Zoom meeting. Me being a father and advocate of a consumer of regional center in Contra Costa County, and I live in Solano County, and everybody knows that in Solano County, it's a volunteer-based type of county. But getting back to y'all guys, this has been a very, very educational moment because I'm also a community advocate. I'm also a community advocate, and also for community-based programs as well as special needs individuals, young and old. And I just I have a grassroots social club movement that I'm doing out here in Solano County, which is called organizedgeneral.com. And when you go there, you'll see the type of individual that I am and what I'm doing for our community. And I just feel like the things that's going on right now for its legislature and consumers should be on, should be definitely on the board. And also there should be some limitation on disparities and only, in every regional center in the 21 counties that they improvise more of a meet and greet structure between the parents and their clients. I think we have gotten away from that, and we need to make it more exceptional. But what I do know is there's a lack of social economics and also caseworkers. So we can do some type of recruitment or open forum or some type of recruitment at these local community colleges, and people that's actually majoring in social services. Let's try to recruit them because we definitely need some more, we definitely need some more caseworkers. And I just want to leave it on this note. Thank everybody for taking the time out their busy schedule to address this. This has been going on for years, and I've been a 24-year advocate for change, and I'm glad something is done about it. God bless, and keep doing what you do.
Great, thank you, Carl. Next, we're moving on to Mari. Mari, you now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Yes, hello. Hi, my name is Maribel Ahumada. I am a mother of a child with special needs. And I just want to say thank you, first of all, for bringing light to this very important issue to our IDD community, which very few times, are the topic of the center of attention for some communities that important like yours. So thankfully, I wanted to say thank you so much for everything. But I also want to say that when it comes to regional centers, it has to be a change. Data has been proven over and over again through the years that nothing has changed. So I think this is the time for change. Our community, our brown community, and Latinos cannot be treated the way they have been treated by the regional center. People call it disparities, I call it discrimination. Orange County in particular needs to change. DDS has to really get involved and make this change happen. And I also want to say thank you to the DBU, Disabilities Voices United, and the Integrated Community Collaborative for making this possible and be part of this change. These two great organizations are there always supporting our community and the IDD community in general, regardless of color and race. So just thank you for everything you do. I truly appreciate it. And hopefully you bring changes and into this very important issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mari. Next, we're moving on to Connie. Connie, you now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, sorry. Yeah, my name is Connie Boyer-Frenzel, and I'm a past president of Autism Society, San Francisco Bay Area. I currently serve on DDS's resource committee, on an SDAC advisory committee, and a few others. I am speaking for my son and for myself. My son is 35 and has a pretty severe autism. So first of all, I want to thank you for all your excellent comments. I just want to reinforce the need for a better data system, first of all. A few years ago in my past job, when we tried to mine data from the CEDAR to determine mortality issues with DD, it was very difficult. Some of them were coded like, oh, they died of autism. So that's just one example of we need to improve our IT system, our databases. It was mentioned earlier about courtesy vendorization. I think that if we could have a better database with our providers, that would help the regional center service coordinators to share information. Many parents don't even know what a courtesy vendorization is, and yet they may live right next door to a different regional center and have, you know, better access. So that's just a concrete suggestion that we really do need to improve it. As far as entitlement programs, well, I'm glad we have one, but they don't work if we don't have the providers. Now, I know this committee is set up to look at general big issues, but I am concerned about in January when the rates for providers are due to be raised. They raised them a bit, but now in comparison to what Governor Newsom just recently presented, which is I think $22 for McDonald's beginning salaries, our salaries aren't going to make it. And I'm very concerned for myself and others that we will not have providers based on the IHSS lower salaries, which are often $17, $18, or $16, and also the regional center funded salaries. So I hope this committee can address that and look at that soon, because I do believe it's going to become a crisis. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the standardization of regulations among the regional centers. What I've seen is that because they all differ in terms of what they consider priorities and giving services, this leads to disparity and also resentment between, well, how come your child is getting this and mine isn't? And so I really think that we do need a little more standardization, regulations statewide for the regional centers. We need better oversight of them. The DDS needs to have a way to enforce the regulations. I think that's probably a big problem, where they can't actually enforce some of these rules, or they're more like guidelines, and so things don't happen. So I hope this committee can look at oversight a little more in depth, and also a way to enforce this. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your next session. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Connie. Next, we're moving on to Tita, turning on your ability to unmute yourself.
You were still muted.
Hi.
There you go.
Yes. Good afternoon. This is Tita Das, and I work for Silicon Valley Independent Living Center in San Jose. I have been assisting people in hospital and nursing home to transition to the community, but my association with this population goes back a long way. You know, like I started being involved with developmental disability. What is it exactly? It has changed the name now, but you know, so I was associated with Area Board 7 here in San Jose, and then I started my working as a life quality assessor in Santa Barbara. with the area board 11, I guess. So I was extremely impressed with all the speakers and their knowledgeable comments. It was definitely an awakening and a complete education for me. And I'm just looking forward to see some definitely evidential, objective impact on the changes of the quality of life. The only thing that comes to my mind is I know for sure anybody with developmental disabilities, if they have an advocate to speak, definitely the chances of getting more attention, more support and services are better. And a person who doesn't have an advocate, how is it going to be the same level of expected resources or services? So I'm just looking forward to see some changes where we can enforce some parity. And so that's one of my dream. And we talk about a lot, the self-determination and person-centered planning, but a lot of times, a lot of our consumers are not able to do that. Can there be a better way to promote or to kind of establish among all our consumers? I would like to see that day. And I would like to see some kind of, I think one of the speaker, everybody's input was excellent, but I was just trying to see listen to the subjective and the objective aspect of it. So just to see like it doesn't only get reflected in our statistics, but it also get reflected in the quality of life of our people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, we have now reached and exceeded our half hour of public comment. For those members of the public who could not make comment today, we will take additional comment at the next hearing on November the 10th. You may also submit written comments to the commission. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I believe we have reached the end of our agenda, and my thanks to you and the other commissioners for 2 very long meetings today. So thank you for sticking with us this long.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for the testimony today. It was the roundtable. It was very impressive. And I know the commission, I can speak on behalf of the commission that we appreciate your passion and your real deep interest in this topic. And we're looking forward to continuing the study.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you also, as Sean did. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.